With the reveal of Warhammer 3, we also got confirmation from Creative Assembly that we will receive a pre-order race pack. It has not been specified, however, if this race will be limited to the Game 3 map or also playable on Mortal Empires. Based on the previous pre-order race pack that is playable on both Game 1 and 2, I'm going to assume the race will be playable on both Game 2 and 3. Given this assumption, who would be the logical races that could fit on both maps? Well, we have a few that spring to mind for several different reasons. In no particular order, we have the Lamians, Chaos Dwarfs, Ogre Kingdoms, Dogs of War, Nagash, and the Hobgoblin Khanate. Each of these have several reasons why they could be the pre-order, along with several solid reasons that would rule them out. So let's put together a list of criteria that each of the races would likely need to meet in order to qualify. This video will be quite lengthy, but I believe it's well worth sticking around, for the results are quite interesting. So the first criteria, I think, would be name recognition. I believe it is in Creative Assembly's interest to keep the more popular races in their back pocket for release as future campaign packs, thus earning more profit from their development. It would make little financial sense to implement one of those popular options as the pre-order and cut themselves off from that revenue. Second would be scope. We can get a good feel of the likely scope of the pre-order race by looking at its Game 2 counterpart, Norska. A good portion of the Norskan roster are reskins or borrow units from other factions. As such, their development costs were reduced. Implementing new models would be one of the more expensive parts of creating a race, so if the race can take existing models as a base, it is more likely to be the pre-order. I can imagine that the Game 3 pre-order will be similar in scope to what we previously received. The third criteria would be location. As I stated before, I am going on the assumption that the race will be playable in both Games 2 and 3, which of course limits the list of candidates. If the race is only playable in Game 3, then this criteria can be ignored, but the other criteria should still hold true. Fourth would be community acceptance. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, would the community be happy with the pre-order race being implemented as such? So for example, would the community have been happy if the Tomb Kings, who had their own 8th edition army book and are considered a major player, would the community have been happy if they were the Game 2 pre-order race and not fully represented? I'd say that a great many people would have been quite upset to see their favourite race so limited in scope. This could be a real concern for Creative Assembly going into Game 3, as we have several popular options that could cause a backlash from parts of the community. Lastly, what additional benefits might the pre-order race provide in terms of future development of other races? Or to put it another way, could the models created in turn be used in rosters of other races that may be released later in the game's lifecycle? So, now we have our criteria, let's place our short list of races against them and see how they match up. So starting with name recognition. Of our list of candidates, there are 3 that stand out to me: Chaos Dwarfs, Ogre Kingdoms, and Nagash. If you are a fan of Warhammer Fantasy, then the odds are high that you have heard of these, whereas the Lamians and the Hobgoblin Khanate are a bit more obscure, and the Dogs of War I would place somewhere in between. As such, I believe that the Chaos Dwarfs, Ogre Kingdoms, and Nagash have far too high a level of name recognition for Creative Assembly to effectively give them away as the Game 3 pre-order race. With the hype around Monogod Chaos Demons, Kislev, and Grand Cathay, that will be more than enough to convince people to buy the game. Or how about the other 3 candidates? Well, the Dogs of War are probably the next most well known, and Creative Assembly could well be considering them for a race pack in the future, but I don't believe that they would consider it too much of a loss to have them as the Game 3 pre-order. As for the Lamians and the Hobgoblin Khanate, I believe neither would be seen as great money makers, so there would be no great loss if they were the pre-order for Game 3. So taking stock, we have 3 of our candidates failing this first hurdle, with the other 3 passing. So, onto our second criteria, scope. Effectively, we are looking to see which races could be implemented with the least amount of development effort and could draw from existing assets for their models, or even include existing units directly in their roster. We will take these one race at a time, starting with the Lamians. As an undead faction, led by a line of vampires, they could easily draw from existing assets, and entire portions of their roster would match up nicely with existing vampire counts. From a development point of view, they would be a good candidate, as Creative Assembly would be able to concentrate their resources on the Lords and the campaign mechanics. Next up is Nagash. Now at first glance he is much like the Lamians, in that a good portion of his roster can be drawn from existing assets and have current units plugged straight into his roster. A figure with the stature of Nagash, however, I feel would deserve a whole nother level of detail, and some additional units to make him stand out from the vampire counts. As such, I would expect more development time would be needed and dedicated to additional models, as his impact upon the world deserves it. Thirdly, we have Chaos Dwarfs. Their roster is an interesting one, as we could theoretically draw assets from Chaos, the Greenskins, and from the Dwarves, to fill out a good portion of their lineup. However, they do have several unique models that would have to be included, such as the Kadai Fireborn, the Kadai Destroyers, and their wide array of war machines. If their full roster were to be included, I believe it would be no small task, and thus they would be precluded. Our next candidate is the Ogre Kingdoms. Of our shortlist, they would easily be the race with the highest development cost and greatest scope. Almost all of their roster would need to be created from scratch, and only a few existing assets could be used. I feel this alone would rule them out as the Game 3 pre-order, though we will test them against the remaining criteria all the same. Now let's consider the Hobgoblin Khanate. They are a race that could draw a lot from existing assets, as we have a variety of goblins in the game already, along with their related beasts. The Hobgoblin Khanate would be a relatively simple race to develop, with the majority of effort put into Lords and their unique mechanics. Finally, we have the Dogs of War. Like many of the races in the shortlist, they can draw upon a lot of existing assets, perhaps more so than any other. This would cut down development time greatly, improving their chances to be the pre-order race. So taking stock, we have 3 of the races, Lamians, Hobgoblins and Dogs of War, which could be added to the game with minimal development costs as the pre-order race pack. 2 additional races, Chaos Dwarfs and Nagash, that require enough development to probably preclude them, and then we have the Ogre Kingdoms, which require far too much work. Our next criteria is location. Where do our candidates reside in the Warhammer world, and could they feasibly appear on both maps? The Lamians, Nagash and Chaos Dwarfs fit the most comfortably in the Game 2 map, and what we are likely to receive in Game 3, as all have settlements in the Darklands. The Ogre Kingdoms are just outside of the Darklands along the border of Cathay, which I feel is too far east for them to be included on the Mortal Empire's map. That leaves us with the Dogs of War and the Hobgoblin Khanate, each of which are interesting in their own respect. The Dogs of War, being mercenaries, might come to the game with no legendary lords or settlements, instead containing a number of heroes and their related units. This means they could effectively be recruited by anyone and don't care about location. The Hobgoblins have their empire in the eastern steppes, but are nomadic and often raid the settlements in the Darklands, so I think it would be possible for them to be implemented as hordes raiding in the northern regions of the map. Effectively, the only race ruled out by location criteria is the Ogre Kingdoms, as the current Mortal Empire's campaign map won't be able to stretch far enough to include their mountain kingdom. So, 3 down, 2 to go, and next up is an interesting one: community acceptance. I think this would be the most clear-cut criteria of all, in that Creative Assembly has worked very hard to keep the community happy, and would not want to jeopardize that over the pre-order race. So how do each of the shortlist races fare? Chaos Dwarfs and Ogre Kingdoms have 8th edition army books and are popular among the community. Choosing either of these as the pre-order race will cause some backlash, as many fans would feel those races would not be done justice. I think a similar argument could be made for Nagash. While his faction isn't of the same scope and doesn't have an army book to draw from, he is nevertheless a very popular character. The remaining 3 candidates, the Lamians, Dogs of War and the Hobgoblin Khanate, are far less likely to cause any sort of backlash if included as the Game 3 pre-order. On the contrary, I believe people would be happy, as the chances may be slim that we would get these races otherwise. So, based on community acceptance, we could rule out Chaos Dwarves, Ogre Kingdoms, and possibly Nagash. That leaves us with one criteria, and I doubt it will weigh heavily on their decision, but it could have some impact nonetheless. What additional benefits, in terms of reduced development costs for future DLC, might each of the candidate races bring? The Lamians and Nagash may well be able to provide some assets that can be used by one another, so they do indeed have a potential benefit. The Chaos Dwarves roster contains a number of Hobgoblin units, so they could well benefit from the Hobgoblins being implemented first, as the pre-order race. Of course, the reverse is also true. If the Chaos Dwarfs were the pre-order and Creative Assembly intend to give us the Hobgoblins as a race pack later in the game's life cycle. The Ogre Kingdoms are a very unique race, with a roster unlike any other, and it would seem unlikely that the assets created for them would translate over to any other race. That leaves the Dogs of War, who would have no real benefit, as most of the models for their roster will be drawn from units already in the game. So let's tally up the results. If the race passes a criteria, they gain a score of 1. If they fail, they score nothing, and if they are borderline, we give them half a point. For the name recognition criteria, the Lamians, Dogs of War, and Hobgoblin Carnate each score 1 point, as they are more obscure races and less likely to be a financial sacrifice for Creative Assembly, while the Chaos Dwarves, Ogre Kingdoms, and Nagash gain no points, as they could very well be profitable if sold as full-blown race packs like the Tomb Kings and Vampire Coast were for Game 2. When we look at the scores for the scope criteria, we once again see the Lamians, Dogs of War, and Hobgoblin Carnate score a point, as they would be able to draw from most existing assets in the game. The Chaos Dwarves and Nagash score half a point each, as a portion of their rosters could draw from existing assets, but they would also have several unique models that would need to be created. Finally, the Ogre Kingdoms scores nothing, as their roster would effectively have to be built from scratch. So how about the scores for the race's location? We see the Lamians, Chaos Dwarves, and Nagash all gain 1 point, as they are well within the Darklands region. The Dogs of War and the Hobgoblin Carnate each score half a point, since they don't fit perfectly but could make an appearance without too much of an issue. The Ogre Kingdoms once again scores nothing, as their realm would just fall outside the confines of the Mortal Empire's map, if extended to the east. On to community acceptance. The Lamians, the Dogs of War, and Hobgoblins each score a point, as they would be unlikely to cause any kind of severe backlash from the community. Nagash scores half a point, as some may feel that a pre-order pack may not do him justice, while the Chaos Dwarfs and Ogre Kingdoms each score nothing, as there is a good possibility that a number of fans will be upset if these two major races with 8th edition army books were to be implemented as pre-order races and not a full-blown campaign pack with 4 lords. Finally, for the future benefits criteria, the Lamians, Nagash, Chaos Dwarfs, and the Hobgoblin Carnate each score a point, since assets created for them could be used in other race packs. The Dogs of War and the Ogre Kingdoms each score nothing, as it is unlikely their assets could be used by any other race packs in the future. When we look at the final results, I believe they are quite interesting. In last place, and the least likely to be the pre-order, is the Ogre Kingdoms, scoring 0 in every category. In 5th position, with a score of 2.5, we find the Chaos Dwarves. They pass some of the criteria, but lose out heavily on name recognition and community acceptance. Taking 4th spot, with a score of 3, and unlikely to be the pre-order, is Nagash. 3rd place, and no great surprise, passing most of the criteria, we have the Dogs of War. Then we have 2nd spot, which goes to, I believe, an unexpected race, the Hobgoblin Carnate. It would seem they have a chance of being the pre-order, which would be an interesting turn of events, and also help fill out the eastern steps on the Game 3 map quite nicely. That leaves us with the Lamians taking top spot, with a perfect score of 5. It would seem that more vampires could well be in our future. So, what does this mean? Well, if Creative Assembly chose the pre-order race by similar criteria, and had the same short list of races to start, then there is a chance that we will see the Lamians as the pre-order, with the Dogs of War and the Hobgoblin Khanate also having reasonable odds. This also means that fans of the Chaos Dwarves and Ogre Kingdoms would have to wait a little bit longer, as they would most likely see their favourite race added as a full-blown campaign pack, receiving more love and attention than they would otherwise get as the pre-order race. Of course, all my assumptions could be wrong, and Creative Assembly may never have considered these criteria or races, and they may have a completely different choice. I guess only time will tell how far off the mark my rankings are. Well, that wraps up this rather lengthy experiment. I hope you have enjoyed this attempt to determine the pre-order race, and will check out the other content on my channel. I now have 50 videos covering various aspects of the Warhammer world, and more on the way. If you're enjoying my content, why not subscribe and click that notification icon. A quick shout out, as always, to Hot Apple Pie. Thanks for the continued support of the channel. I'm Grey Tiger, and I'll catch you next time.